She'll be talking about dynamics and inequality. Please join me in welcoming our speaker.
Well, thank you, Erica, and thank you all so much for having me. I'm really honored to be here, and I'm excited to be giving my first talk to a puppy. So yeah, this talk is part of a larger project that I've been doing. I published this book this year called The Origins of Fairness. And what I do in it is use cultural evolutionary models to look at the emergence of unfair or inequitable conventions between social groups. This project draws a lot on previous empirical and theoretical work in the various social sciences. I'm a philosopher of science, but I draw a lot on this sort of existing work and think of this as, one modeling complement that brings some of it together under a similar framework. When I saw this book cover for the first time, I was like, I think this is the most beautiful book cover pretty much ever made. Like, I'm going to be the author of the pinkest book that you can see in the library. All right. So for today, in this talk, what I'm going to do is introduce a kind of framework for explaining the emergence of inequitable conventions of bargaining, especially that emerge across different social categories. And then I'll also talk about how the power of a social group can potentially contribute to this emergence of inequity using this kind of framework. And the set of methods that I use, I'll say a little bit about because I take it this is an interdisciplinary audience with some diverse background and familiarity with different methods. So I use game theory in my work, which is a branch of math where you use simplified models called games that represent strategic interactions in the human sphere. And by strategic, I just mean interactions where you have more than one individual, where everyone cares what the other individuals do. And I especially use tools from evolutionary game theory. So this was a kind of branch that emerged in biology and then moved into the social sciences that starts with games and then looks at how groups of individuals playing games evolve or culturally evolve strategies and behaviors in these games. And since bargaining is a paradigmatic strategic behavior, and conventions of bargaining often do emerge on cultural evolutionary timescales via cultural change and learning, that's why I think this is an appropriate methodology for the phenomena that I'm interested in here. So the main idea here is to sort of use these models to derive some basic causal stories about what happens when groups of individuals bargain with each other, and then use those to try to shed light on some real-world phenomena, hooking up with work in different areas and empirical observations. All right, so that's kind of the big picture. Here's the route we're going to take into this. So first, in the Nash demand game and the evolution of fairness, I'll describe the Nash demand game, which is the main model of bargaining that I use throughout my work and many other people have used. So what I'll do is discuss in particular how this game has been employed in philosophy, which has mostly been not to explain inequity, but rather the cultural emergence of fairness, equitable behavior. Then in part two, the evolution of inequity, I'll observe that despite this body of previous work looking at why we expect fairness to emerge in bargaining scenarios, sometimes in the real world things aren't fair. And so I'll discuss some evolutionary models that provide a framework for thinking about why that might be. And then last, in part three, power and the evolution of bargaining, I'll present a series of results showing what happens when you have different social groups learning how to bargain with each other, and one of them is more powerful in different sorts of ways. What happens then? And I'll talk a little bit about the application of these results to a couple particular cases. All right. So part one. So I'll start by describing the Nash demand game in a kind of more intuitive way. It's also sometimes called divide the pie. So imagine you and a friend have this delicious cherry pie and you want to divide it, and the way you'll do that is you each say what portion of the pie you want. Then if you have compatible demands for pi, meaning you're not asking for more than one pi total, you're each going to get what you asked for. But if you have incompatible demands, you each want 2/3 of the pie, say, the assumption is you're going to fight, you can't come to a good agreement, and so you're going to get a low payoff because you didn't manage to divide this pie well. So I want you to imagine that you were actually going to play this game with a stranger, and think for a minute about what you would ask for. All right, Erica, how much would you ask for of the pie? Say you love pie.
Are they dividing the pie, or?
So you're both going to make a request for some portion of it, and if you request more than 100%,
Yeah, 50.
50%. Okay, how many people thought 50%? That is unsurprising, because as I'll explain in a minute, this is what happens when you put people in the lab and they play this game almost every time. All right, so this game I just described is probably the most widely employed model of bargaining in game theory. I don't know why I said probably. It's the most widely employed model of bargaining in game theory. The version that I just described may sound a little bit stupid, but this has actually proved to be a pretty powerful and flexible model. You don't have to assume you have two people who are literally standing there demanding 70 and 30% of a pie. Instead, the basic structure is that you have individuals who divide a resource who have different ways that they could split that resource that would advantage one or the other of the individuals. So many possible splits could occur here. And if they can't agree, they do it poorly. And if they can agree, they get some benefit, which is some portion of the pie. So it's been used to represent things like countries outlining trade agreements, salary negotiations for new hires, and the division of labor in the household. So one question we might ask is, what do we expect people to do in this game? So game theorists build models that are supposed to represent real strategic interactions, and then of course analyze those models in an attempt to understand the interactions. So what does an analysis of this game tell us to expect when we look at bargaining? And this is an important question to answer before finding out what it can tell us about fairness and unfairness. So we'll start answering that question with the Nash Equilibrium concept. So if you're not familiar with this concept, a Nash Equilibrium in a game is some set of strategies or behaviors in that game where no one can switch what they're doing and improve their outcome. It's usually the most important concept used to predict human behavior in games, because when you have this kind of scenario, everyone is doing the best they can given the interactive structure and the behaviors of their partners. And so there's some sort of stability to Nash equilibria because there is no incentive to do something else. So they end up being predictive of human behavior in the laboratory, at least to some degree, and they end up also being important in evolutionary models as well as very common endpoints of evolutionary trajectories. So the Nash demand game has an infinity of Nash equilibria. These are every pairing of strategies where the actors perfectly divide the resource. So why would there be infinite Nash equilibria in this game? So you have two players who are dividing the resource. If one is choosing 10 and the other 90, or one is choosing 54 and the other 46, so any perfect division, well, there's two ways they could change strategies. They could demand more or less. And if they demand more, then they're over-demanding the resource and getting this sort of poor conflict payoff. If they demand less, they just get less. Is that clear to people? Does that make sense? So despite the surfeit of equilibria, in experimental settings, people almost exclusively arrive at the 50-50 split. And we just saw in our little show of hands that the majority of people in this room would demand 50% if paired with someone randomly to play this game. Furthermore, if you look across cultures, many cultures have stated norms of fairness. And often these norms of fairness, in many cases, push towards this 50-50 division. So how should two individuals divide the pie? Well, it would be fair for them to split it exactly in half and to each take half. So the evidence suggests that we have this important equilibria out of all of these equilibria, and this creates an explanatory demand, which is to say what is special about the fair split. So in philosophy, Brian Skirms and Jason Alexander, and in economics, Peyton Young have been some of the people who have taken up the task of explaining this puzzle. And in doing so, they've used evolutionary models meant to represent cultural change, learning, and adaptation. So the idea is something like we have these models from game theory that are static, that we usually analyze appealing to human rationality. They have these many equilibria. There are many variations on them that might suggest one or the other coming out. But another option is to just ask, well, what equilibria would in fact emerge in a process of cultural evolution? And so that's what they're doing. To answer this question, they look at simplified versions of this game. And in fact, this is usually necessary when looking at evolutionary models to get something tractable to work with. So here's a version of what's called a payoff table of such a simplification. So this is the kind of game that I've worked with broadly. What we'll do is assume, okay, the size of the pie is 10. We just put an arbitrary number there. And rather than having infinite possibilities, we'll say there are 3 things that individuals could ask for. They could either ask for a low amount of the pie, a medium amount of the pie, or a high amount of the pie. Let's just say, for simplicity's sake, that when they ask for low, they ask for 4, medium is 5, and high is 6. So this represents the structure of that game. We have player 1 and player 2. They each have these 3 demands for 4, 5, and 6. And then we can see that if they say both demanded low, well, 4 plus 4, that's 8, it's less than the total pie, so they each get 4. If they both demanded medium, they each get 5. But if one demanded high and one demanded medium, they ask for too much and they get a low payoff, which we'll just say here is 0. So this is the kind of game that they look at. This game has 3 equilibria, which are again the compatible demands that perfectly divide the pie. So player 1 gets 6 and player 2 4, or both 5, or vice versa. Again, these are the equilibria because if either outcome gets more, they reach the disagreement point, this kind of low payoff, and if they ask for less, they get less. So notice that in this limited minigame, we do reproduce this same kind of puzzling explanatory question. We still have multiple equilibria that can emerge, and the question again is, why is fairness special? Why does that one emerge more? All right, any questions at this point or clarifications?
Are you assuming that each one makes an offer and that's it, or can they negotiate later?
Yeah, so it's assumed, there are a lot of bargaining models where you have a back and forth, which is in many ways more realistic when it comes to an individual process of bargaining. In evolutionary models, they usually collapse it all and just assume there's sort of these 3 possibilities, and that can represent a whole process of bargaining, but the idea is you could be more aggressive, more passive, or sort of in the middle. And then if you're too aggressive, you'll end up at the lower outcome. If you're more passive, you'll get less. So it kind of collapses it all. Other questions? All right. So to summarize what they find, when you evolve this game, the fair demand is almost always the most likely to arise. Unless you do some really weird models, it arises most often. Otherwise, you see a mix of compatible unequal demands arising, so like 4 and 6 together. And this is true across models with very disparate assumptions. So models where you assume an infinite population or a finite population, models where there are all sorts of different rules for how the actors learn or update their behaviors and strategies. Models with randomness built in, models that are deterministic, you see this kind of again and again. So to give a really hand-wavy explanation of why this is a special equilibrium, imagine a population where everyone uses this fair demand, and my population here are chimps in academic regalia. So this is going to be an efficient group in the sense that whenever any 2 of them meet, they'll reach a Nash equilibrium and perfectly divide the resource. No resource is ever going to get wasted, and they're never going to have a conflict over it. And this is the only kind of population where that's true, where every individual demands medium, because medium is the only symmetric possibility in this game, where you can still perfectly divide the resource. So if you had another population, say with some high and some low, Now every time the lows meet each other or they meet a medium, they sort of under-demand the resource. When the highs meet each other or a medium, they over-demand the resource. So you see inefficiency in any other group. And that's the kind of the deep underlying reason of why fairness is so special in these evolutionary models and why it pops out of the model again and again and again. All right, so the focus of this entire research project, especially in philosophy, is on explaining fairness. And so most iterations on these models have looked at conditions in which fairness is not just likely to emerge, but certain to emerge, and then arguing for the relevance of these conditions in human groups. So things like when we keep interacting with the same neighbors, then fairness happens even more often. So that's been the kind of focus of that project. All right, so any questions about that kind of history and philosophy and economics? Yeah, Erica.
I was just wondering about the sort of underlying idea of fairness, because it seemed like when you had the chimps in academic robes, right? Fair there, a 50-50 split sort of assumes that the needs of each individual is the same.
Yeah.
But if you're splitting between, say, parents and children, or, you know, I don't know, like an elderly person who's infirmed, and I mean, just how do you, so yeah.
How do you say what fairness
right.
is? Good. So in this game, in these models, under most reasonable interpretations of the model, you have to be talking about, in fact, some equal division of resource. But one thing I talk about in the book is that when it comes to notions of fairness, cultural notions of fairness, they're often not an equal division of resource, but there's something that everyone agrees upon. So to give another example, besides the like people have different needs, people might have put work into creating a resource. So if I bake a pie, no one thinks that fair would demand that I give you half of my pie, right? Or ownership might play a role. And so I've sort of been thinking about, but haven't really got to, how I would model the actual emergence of these norms of what counts as fair, separate from the actual amount of resources individuals are getting. It ended up being a really thorny question, but yeah, so anyway, that's the... Anything else? Okay. So with that, let's move on to part 2, the evolution of inequity. So we have this experimental evidence suggesting humans often bargain fairly. We often have these norms for fairness. But, and I'm sure this is going to shock you as mostly anthropologists, if we turn to actual observed bargaining behavior in the wild, sometimes people do not treat each other fairly. So we see a pretty serious disconnect between what we observe in real human behavior and what we observe both in the lab and stated as norms. So it's been particularly documented that in many cultures, certain types of people get less and others more in real-world bargaining scenarios, and that can often constitute a pattern that goes across many kinds of bargaining scenarios within a society. So let me introduce a term from sociology to discuss some of the empirical observations regarding this. So some sociologists use this term social categories to track categories of individuals that are widely recognized in a society and which members of that society use to guide their behaviors towards others. So I can identify what category you belong to, and then that can shape how I treat you, how I behave when I interact with you. Cecilia Ridgway, who's a sociologist at Stanford, pulls out primary social categories as those that are most important for shaping interpersonal behavior, especially across many domains, and argues that if we look across societies, gender and age almost always constitute primary social categories, and then very commonly things like race, class, caste, and religious affiliation do as well. So for our purposes, one of the most important things about social categories is this kind of conditioning of behavior. So the idea that individuals can use category membership to choose how they're going to interact with a partner. And if we were talking about a bargaining scenario, could use category membership to determine how much they're going to demand when encountering another individual. So just to give a few empirical examples, and we could give thousands of them from various literatures, prices for used cars are usually determined by some kind of often explicit bargain. If you look at the first offers made by used car salespeople, they give lower first offers to men than women, and to white people than to people of color. Another empirical example relates to division of labor in the household, so who spends how much time working and how much time in leisure in running a household. And for many cultures, studies find that women spend more time, significantly more time than men, doing work to support the household. Okay, so we often have these unfair divisions. They're often sort of society-wide patterns. Of course, they're never perfect, but you see some consistency. And this introduces a new explanatory demand to say why, despite the ubiquity of fair bargaining in these models, we would see so much inequity in the world. So some of the people who first presented sort of these evolutionary models of this were Peyton Young, who had also worked on the evolution of fairness, Robert Axtell, and J.P. Epstein. So I'll talk a little bit about their work, which sort of started the framework that I really develop in the book and use like for a lot of papers looking at unfairness between groups. So usually in cultural evolutionary models, the assumption is one interacting group. You're usually interested in some society where there are going to be interactions between many numbers. But if you want to capture the evolution of behavior in groups with social categories, you're going to need to model at least kind of two groups, or you might say two tags of actors, two classes of some sort. So now you might look at a model where you have actors evolving to play a bargaining game, but instead of there being one sort of actors, we assume there's some kind of recognizable tag that allows them to differentiate each other. So in this absurd representation, I now have academic chimps and academic orangutans. So once you have this kind of setup, so you take everything the same in the model, you just add this possibility that the individuals can differentiate each other and then use that differentiation to shape what demands they make. Now you have a scenario where you see any of these three equilibria evolving. So you have equilibria where when the two types interact with each other, one type always demands high and the other low, or where they make fair demands, or the first type demands low and the other high. And notice this creates a scenario where we can get some kind of bare bones representation of the emergence of discrimination. Because when you're at these kinds of conventions of behavior, individuals are paying attention to what is the type of my interactive partner and then treating them differently in a way that systematically detriments one group. So obviously there's no notions of bias built into this model, but we can see something that looks like discrimination emerging. And what these authors argue is that these kinds of conventions emerge robustly in these models with social categories, and much of my subsequent work confirms that this is indeed a robust, widespread result. So you just add this little thing and you go from fairness to unfairness being the norm, the common thing that emerges. So why, let's return to our primates. So now because you have two groups, you can reach these different equilibria. New equilibria are available to them. And in these equilibria, they demand fair when they meet their own in-groups. And then whenever they meet the out-group, one side demands high and one is low. And at these equilibria, at this kind of population outcome, notice we no longer have inefficiency. So now we have unfair demands, but it's entirely efficient in the sense that when any two individuals meet, they're always going to reach a Nash equilibrium. And they can do that because we've added just this extra bit of social information, which is I'm this type, you're that type. And then they can have different expectations for what that means when they bargain. And that makes inequality efficient. Does that make sense to people? Okay. So the kind of takeaway from this history of modeling is that it's actually easy to get inequity to emerge in this kind of evolutionary scenario. Just divide the groups up. When you don't have that division, fairness tends to emerge, otherwise it doesn't. or it's not special anymore. Okay, so let me move on to part 3 and talk a little more about variations on models of this sort. So I'm going to talk about one part of my project on this emergence of unfair conventions that uses this evolutionary game theoretic framework. There have been a number of papers under this project where myself and various collaborators who are splattered over there have looked at things like intersectional disadvantage. So what if you have multiple tags and they intersect with each other? Dividing the products of joint labor. What if you first have to bargain to say who's going to do how much work to produce a good, and then have to bargain to say who's going to get how much of that good? Minority disadvantage. When you have these tags, what if one is small? What does that change in this kind of cultural emergence? Homophily in general and in science. So if you have this kind of evolutionary scenario and you end up with discrimination and individuals can choose who they interact with, who do they end up interacting with, do they avoid those who aren't like them? And then norm change. Can this tell us anything about what we might do in cases where we have inequitable norms and conventions in a real society? So I'm going to, in particular, describe joint work with Justin Bruner. So he's another philosopher of science and political scientist who's at University of Arizona, where we consider how power might influence the process by which inequitable conventions emerge using these kinds of models. We look at a particular instantiation of the model where we suppose that cultural evolution is happening via imitation, where people see what sorts of behaviors are working for group members and then repeat the behaviors that work and are less likely to repeat the behaviors that don't work. So to just kind of say more specifically what the model is, so we have a population where there are 2 interacting types, everybody interacts. They're supposed to be like social categories. They play a bargaining game round after round after round. They start with random strategies, and then in each round they sort of look around and see, well, which of my group members are doing particularly well in this interaction, and then they're more likely to imitate those group members. And then we run these models, until the populations reach equilibria, and we see which of these 3 equilibria emerged. Group 1 did better, group 2 did better, or they made fair demands of each other. Does that make sense? Okay. I'll add, so I'm presenting this work from this paper with Justin, but then in other work I've tested this using very different modeling assumptions just to see, was this some relic of the model? And you pretty much get the same stuff emerging. Okay, so I'll break this now into 2 mini parts, which will help us separate results. So here's what we did in thinking about power. So power is actually a really messy concept. It can mean a lot of different things, and at least in the philosophical literature on power, people define it in different ways, break it out in different ways. So what we decided to do was not try to come up with some clear definition of what we mean by power, but rather to operationalize it in a bunch of different ways. So test a bunch of things that could associate with having power and see what happens in these different scenarios. And so I'm going to describe 2 of the ways we operationalize power here. So the first one had to do with disagreement points. So we changed the disagreement points of the players. So what do I mean by this? Disagreement points, again, are these payoffs that they get when bargaining breaks down. So what happens when bargaining fails? What payoff do they receive? So before, other people were looking at these disagreement points assuming they're the same for different actors, which is just kind of a simplifying assumption. But maybe if one actor is in really great economic shape, it doesn't matter so much to them if the bargain breaks down. Whereas for another actor, if they're in poor economic shape, it might really be important to them. And so what we do, let's quickly look at this payoff table. We make everything the same as before, except we assume that player 1 gets big D when bargaining fails, and player 2 gets little d, and we just assume that big D is going to be bigger than little d. And so here are results where we said, okay, make little d 0, and then let's vary big D. So make one side increasingly more powerful. And then let's see what emerges when we run this model many times. So what are the probabilities of getting these different, discriminatory or fair outcomes as we change this disagreement point? So here are our results. So on the x-axis, we're varying D, we're making one side more and more powerful. Otherwise, this was the game you were seeing earlier where they could demand 4, 5, or 6. And these track the 3 possible equilibria for the model, the fair equilibria and the 2 discriminatory equilibria. And as power goes up, we see fairness dropping off almost to 0. We see the outcome where the powerless group gets more drop to 0, and then the outcome where the powerful group gets more go almost to 1. So changing this disagreement point changes quite dramatically what ends up happening for the different social groups. So why would this happen? Basically, what's going on in these models is this higher disagreement point makes actors less compelled to learn low demands. So now there's not a big difference for them between low and the disagreement point. They're almost, they're going to get something close to low. And so that makes them more likely to demand higher things throughout the game as they imitate each other. I'll point out that there's some analogy here to earlier work in economics on bargaining. So Nash, in his early work on bargaining, looked at different threat points, which essentially were disagreement points, and argued that if there are 2 individuals bargaining and I can levy a really serious threat at you, which should lower your disagreement point, then I should be able to get more. But his work entirely depended on these kind of axiomatic treatment of what you should expect to come out of bargaining. So it's a very different reason for why disagreement points as power should matter in bargains. That's just a little side note. Any questions about this? Okay. So the second result I'll describe had to do with outside options. So an outside option in a model assumes that actors don't have to engage in the strategic situation, but have some ability to go off by themselves and get payoff all alone. So what we did was added another strategy to the game, the outside option. Please ignore the names of these strategies. It should be low, medium, high, outside option. I forgot to change the figure. So we added another strategy. What we see embedded here is the game we've been looking at. So they can either play the bargaining game or they can do their own thing. So maybe they just go off and do their own work instead of engaging in some kind of joint production. Maybe they never get married instead of having to divide labor in the household. And we assume that one actor always gets H when they pick the outside option, big H, and the other actor gets small h. So they have some different ability to kind of go it alone. They get some different payoffs for that. So this game now sometimes will have 4 equilibria instead of 3. So the outside option is always going to be an equilibria. They both just ignore the other player. And it's an equilibria because if you're both doing your own thing, you can't switch to bargaining unilaterally. The other person would have to switch to bargaining too. So that's a stable outcome. Then we have the 3 equilibria from before, but sometimes these equilibria disappear depending on how high the outside option is. So here I've made a version of the game where if you demanded low at equilibria, you get 3. And when you have that low number and you get 4 for the outside option, so if I were player 1 and I were here, I could just unilaterally switch to doing my own thing, and so this is no longer an equilibrium. Does that make sense to people? Okay, so now we have a scenario where the ability to leave the bargain can disrupt the possibilities of these equilibria. And what we do is, again, look at a model where one side always has an outside option that's 0, so they can't actually get a payoff there. And the other side has an outside option that is getting bigger and bigger, and then we ask, how does that influence outcomes? So here's what we find. So again, on the x-axis, the outside option is just getting higher and higher. And again, this is how often we see the different possibilities emerging. And as the outside option gets higher, first the possibility where the powerful group gets low just disappears. It's no longer an equilibria. because their outside option got so high, it's no longer worth it to them to ever get low. So they'll just leave the bargain if they're getting low. Then the outcome where they get medium disappears, because at some point their outside option is so high, it's not worth it to them to ever get medium. And if we make it high enough, eventually the outcome where they get high disappears as well. The other person can only get 0 in any case there. All right, so what's happening here is now that as this outside option increases, some bargaining equilibria disappear, but in such an order that the equilibria that favor one social group are the only ones left in these kind of intermediate places. We might think this is analogous to a situation where, say, you had landowners and sharecroppers, and the landowners could hunt on their land, so they're guaranteed some base rate of payment from this land. And the sharecroppers need to bargain with the landowners to make any money. So the owners should never accept a bargain that gets them less payoff than hunting on their land, right? So the sharecroppers are disempowered in that way, in that case. So the kind of main takeaway from these models, we look at different variations of power too, is that power can translate into resources when we're talking about cultural evolution. So when it comes to emerging bargaining conventions between groups, power can multiply and transfer in these cases. So if you have power today, that should translate to resources tomorrow. And here we're talking about, right, conventions, not just individual bargains. And so presumably to more power tomorrow as well. So before finishing, what I'll do is just discuss 2 examples of cases where you can apply these models and where we have applied these models. So one, which I've kind of been mentioning a little, is to the emergence of household bargaining between genders. So there we have a case where in most societies, gender is a primary social category. People recognize it and use it to condition behavior. And there are often, in many societies, systematic power differences between members of different genders. So the disagreement point model applies in cases where one gender systematically has a worse fallback position should bargaining fail at home because, say, of economic disempowerment or physical threat. So in economics, people have used this kind of model use disagreement points to track something like what happens should you divorce. So should your household bargain just entirely fail? And if women can't get good jobs in the case of divorce or are under physical threat, they should have a lower disagreement point in general. The outside options model will correspond to cases where one gender has worse access to individual earnings. So if you're thinking about forming a household and one gender is able to choose not to form a household, and one gender has to form a household in order to survive, then the one that is able to choose not to form a household because they have some outside option should get more in the kind of bargaining convention that emerges. Questions? So the other case that we look at moves away from the sort of social category interpretation of the model and more just to general possible category interpretations. So what we looked at was the emergence of bargaining conventions across the academic hierarchy. So when academics collaborate with each other, they produce some joint surplus good, right? They produce a paper that gets them credit, attention, citations, the things scientists want. Also, maybe they like producing knowledge. So they can produce this resource, but in order to do so, there has to be at least an implicit bargain made about who's going to do the work to produce this resource, and then who is going to, say, be first author and give the talks and get more of the credit. So there's some bargain there. In addition, when we're talking about professors and grad students, there are clear power differences that are often systematic across these categories. So when we're thinking about disagreement points, it's often the case that if collaboration should fail, an established academic has a lot less to lose than a grad student. So a professor already has a job, they probably have other papers in the works. This one paper isn't going to matter that much, whereas for a grad student, that might make the difference between becoming an academic or not. And then when it comes to outside options, you again have a similar kind of power differential where an established academic can often expect greater payoff from working alone, so may not need to collaborate because, say, they already own a lab or they know how to publish on their own. And an unestablished counterpart might not be able to produce a resource at all on their own. So those are two kinds of cases where, given these power differentials and a case where, or a situation where you see bargains emerging often implicitly on cultural timescales, you might expect the power to influence who's getting how much. All right, so to conclude, fairness isn't the expected bargaining outcome once you add social categories to populations, or rather once you add tags to models. There are different ways to interpret power in a Nash demand game. Several of these give advantage to powerful evolving social groups when it comes to bargaining. And this modeling framework can arguably be applied to address different kinds of groups, different aspects of inequity. Of course, there are dangers to doing that because you want to be sensitive and thinking about inequity to all the sort of contextual things that matter, the ways that things like actual bias and discrimination matter, the details of cases matter. But if used carefully, it can be a good framework to illustrate some kinds of deep patterns related to inequity. Thank you.
First, thanks, a super interesting talk. I was wondering if you could go a little bit into the actual dynamics of how is it just the mere inclusion of a tag that lends itself to a equilibrium of inequality, or is it sort of baked into the inclusion of the tag that you're gonna make an offer and everybody knows sort of that that's what is happening there?
So basically, when you add tags, if you add tags in the following way, you have them and then individuals can decide what strategy to use on the basis of the tag, so they can condition their behavior on the tag. That addition is the thing that creates these new equilibria and completely changes the course of evolution in the models. So there's no way in which I'm baking in assumptions like I am always going to be demanding high more often of this group, or differences in their initial states. Initially it's totally random. They might be just as likely to demand high of their own in-group and medium of the out-group, and then this just emerges sort of through the evolutionary process because of these new equilibria that they can reach.
So I wanted to ask about, I think, your first example at the end about household bargaining.
Yeah.
Which just made me kind of think about the sort of history of family dynamics versus what's happening right now. So we have the sort of habitus of, traditionally women have had fewer employment opportunities outside the household, but nowadays those have shifted, and women, at least in sort of certain kinds of professions, have better employment opportunities.
Better outside
the
options.
Right, exactly. So how does the sort of decision making or the specific circumstances for one family relate to the kind of cultural ideas about family dynamics that have this sort of weight of the habitus of family bargaining? Because is there any is that something that you modeled or you thought how can we sort of reconcile those things?
Yeah, good. So I think there's actually two separate things to pull out there. So one is first this notion that so disagreement points and outside options can change, and in the case of gender, have changed in many countries. One thing that a lot of people in the empirical literature keep being what? Is that often you see this change in economic empowerment, but a huge lag in the change when it comes to household bargaining and norms, right? So it's still the case that women who are empowered do more in the household for kind of a long time. And on original, rationality-based economics models, that wouldn't be predicted. Because the prediction would be as soon as you are individually empowered, you can use that to get what you want in the household. So part of what I argue in the book is that like, well, it's because it's having to do with cultural norms and cultural change timescales, right? Where you see this lag, you have a rule that you're learning from other individuals, and that rule continues pushing you in the same direction, even as disagreement points and outside options change. So that's one thing. Another thing has to do with the relationship between what happens in an individual household and what's happening in a whole society, right? So if you look at what, how household labor actually gets divided, there's obviously in every society a lot of variation, but then there are systematic differences as well. So some societies you see more equity, others more inequity, and then of course there were particular detailed patterns about like who does the cooking and this and that. So I end up, I have a chapter where I sort of argue like, okay, well let's take these sort of individual rationality-based models and the cultural models and just do a little handshake, right? So you see these kind of cultural expectations emerging slowly and broadly, and those create a kind of grounding effect for about how much inequity you're going to be seeing. But then in any particular couple, the particular empowerment of the people and their personalities and a million other things matters to how that household bargain ends up going, right? So the systematicity is kind of explained by these models, and then the variation by economics style models. Yeah.
Can I ask a quick follow-up?
Yeah, sure.
So, is there, I guess, what sorts of mechanisms or actions or forces cause those two things to sort of come into alignment with one another? Let's say you have a historically disadvantaged group or a minority that becomes in the majority, but is still, the cultural forces are still kind of, I don't know, dictating, but like, strongly influencing the sort of behavior in particular bargaining situations such that it's not quote unquote rational. But, and so are there particular like political kinds of things, like how do you like switch? How do you are there just, moments like household bargaining or whatever where, are there things that like could be done on like a social implementation kind of like, come on, let's
start. Yeah. So what I like end up talking about in the book is like, so there are all these kind of general discussions, right, of norm and convention change, including on the basis of game theoretic models. What should we do? But the evolutionary models, there are at least some things that are kind of special and relevant to these models. So one is this expectation of the stickiness of norms, and along with that, an idea that a norm can be eroded before it changes. So something like the payoffs could be changing. This could be a continually more unstable norm because now there are different outside options and different disagreement points. The conditions in which it emerged are different. So you can have a situation where a norm has become less stable, but you're not actually seeing much behavior change. And then you can have, and what that can mean is that some behavior change can then lead to sort of surprising discontinuity in social behavior. And so sometimes you see that happening. So like that's one thing that I think is sort of relevant, that like if you're, say, doing moral education, and that might change people's kind of internal payoffs, or if you are empowering people from some group economically, and then you're not seeing all the changes you want to, you still could be making progress, I guess is what I'm trying to say. And then another thing is that like, given the kind of stability of social level conventions, right, they're equilibria, right, they have their own kind of stability and logic that keeps them going. To see change, someone has to actually change behavior and like hurt themselves for a bit. They gotta like up the stream and get pushed back on in order for change to actually happen, which of course that's not a huge shock. Like everyone knows that to some degree, but yeah. Yeah, sure.
Thank you. I thought it was interesting that you pointed out the difficulties with modeling power or turning power into a formalized concept in the model. I guess I had two-part question. One is, I might have missed the formal setup, but could you just explain in the real world how the difference between disagreement points
And
and
outside options.
outside options would work.
Yeah.
And, because they both seem to be cases where if there's a breakdown, one party loses less.
Sort
Or has,
of, yeah.
at least that's how you explained it in the,
Well, so here's, I think, a relevant observation here. In many cases where you would expect one social group to have lower disagreement points,
Mhm.
you would also expect them to have lower outside options. Because they both often relate to something like economic empowerment or physical empowerment. Now, if you look at the way they're actually instantiated in the model, with an outside option, there's some idea that when the bargaining breaks down, that's still really bad for both parties. So if they try to bargain and it breaks down, they're still really hurt. So that could be
Right.
somewhere, like a case where, like, in the case of divorce, you have legal protections for both sides such that they can both really rip each other apart or something. Even if one of them is more economically empowered, maybe the other side is protected by the law and harmed. Whereas in the other case, right, their only option is to go into the bargain, see what happens, and then see what comes out. Now, of course, as I said, like, if you have a case where one gender is relatively empowered or one race is relatively empowered, they'll usually have both things. And so you could do a model where you put them both together, and there's two kinds of power, and combining those two models, I can tell you what will happen, they'll, like, you know, get high more. Yeah.
so I guess my second question, that's helpful, thank you. Are there other ways you could model power? And
Yeah.
what would they be?
Yeah, there's a lot of other ways you can model power. So one other thing we do in this paper is look at what we call background payoffs. And so that we sort of developed in thinking about the academia case, the idea that, like, one side is getting some sort of steady supply of, you know, in the academia case, the numbers we usually interpret to be like credit, which is a weird concept, but something like attention, the approval of your peers, you know, and all the things that come along with it. So if one side is sort of steadily publishing papers already, they have this kind of high background payoff, and the other doesn't have a high background payoff, that can shift the dynamics so that the first side is basically just less sensitive to the bargain. They learn less quickly, they react less quickly to what the other side is doing, which can create a disadvantage for the other side, who's sort of very quickly dashing about accommodating the first side. So that is like another way to model power. Another thing you can do, which would relate to these homophily models, is have situations where individuals can choose who they bargain with, and you can make that asymmetric between the two groups. So it could be that individuals of one group always get to offer to the other individuals, do you want to bargain with me? And the other individuals can't. And so some people have thought of just the fact of, like, gender asymmetries in proposals, or asking out possible romantic cases as somehow corresponding to that kind of power difference. And certainly with things like jobs, that's a big power difference, where a corporation gets to pick who gets offered the bargain in the first place. And they can pick sometimes an individual who they expect to take a low bargaining offer. Yeah, so those are a couple other ways. In philosophy, people often divide power into power to and power over, where power to is supposed to be something like my individual ability to self-actualize, to get done the things I want to get done, and power over is my ability to coerce others to do what I want them to do. And so some of these notions fall more into one or the other camp.
Great, thank you.
So, actually, building on your response to Clark's question, I am curious if you've played around with any of the kind of network bargaining games, in which context the sort of nature of the outside option is kind of quasi-structurally determined, and you could imagine there being some variation in the different types access to structural positions that are more or less advantageous. So I'm just curious if you've explored those.
No, I don't think so. So are you talking about a game where they would be able to move positions in a social network?
So, I mean, one example would be, you know, everyone has to pick one partner to play with. In order to match, so you essentially have some network, there's a matching process that occurs. you could do this kind of demand game or a sort of full-blown bargaining
Full bargaining.
game, right? And, you know, so typically if you're in a position where you can say have a lot of, I started thinking about this because of thinking about like, well, what's the difference between established academics and graduate students? So, you know, like, they typically are all connected to like one more senior person who can pick from amongst these various, right? And that's one way, I mean, in those models, you see those positions tend to be associated with very asymmetric division of the value of the edge.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So I think that connects up with this notion of who can choose their partners
Right,
and who
exactly.
can't. And I had not thought about modeling that vis-a-vis network location, but that would be a supernatural thing to do. And the only thing I've done really using networks was this work with Hannah where we assumed individuals have network connections that evolve themselves, but the network connections are responsive to how much payoff they're getting in their bargains. And so if you're getting low payoff with that individual, you tend to disconnect. And we were trying to explain, so there are different, like, there's empirical work in different academic disciplines, particularly in economics, has found like gender-based homophily and co-authorship.
Right.
So people tend to co-author much more with people of their own gender than the opposite gender. And that might just be because people tend to do everything with members of their own gender more, but it might also be a kind of like reasonable reaction to credit inequality. And so, yeah, we modeled that. But yeah, this I like this suggestion.
I have a question. So, in thinking about how you sort of started out the talk, thinking about evolutionary implications of things, have you, a lot of what you focused on are thinking about these models within human actors, but have you, or other people that you could share with us, modeled these kind of thinking about non-human actors where,
Yeah.
you know, you don't, there's different settings that you would have in your model perhaps?
Yeah, originally I was gonna like also include this whole thing on like sexual selection and yeah, I very quickly was like, there's no world in which I have the space to do that in one book. So these models they're very similar, sometimes structurally identical to models in biology looking at cross-species mutualisms. And so I haven't ever looked at cross-species mutualisms, but I've drawn, for example, on the work of Carl Bergstrom and Michael Lockman, looking at what happens when the rate of evolution is higher in one species or another. Yeah. So Justin first was like looking at those models, and sometimes you see these advantages to evolving faster or to evolving less fast. And he applied this to the case of minority interaction, because when you have minority groups, if you think about it, so say you're in 10% of a subgroup and you're all kind of randomly interacting. Maybe you're in a company and you're in a small racial minority in that company. Then you're interacting with your outgroup 90% of the time. Those in the majority are interacting with their outgroup 10% of the time. And so you expect the minority group to learn much more quickly how to interact with their outgroup because they're doing it 9 times as often. And that can really shift what happens in these models. So it can very much shift the dynamics of which side gets more and which gets less. So drawing on that work, you know, I've done other modeling work on that, but also some collaborators and I, including one of my grad students, did a human subjects experiment where we like actually had a small group and a large group bargain in the lab, play the Nash demand game. We didn't tell them what their group size was, so we just had it be the case that the small group was more often interacting because that would be the same kind of structure. We found that they ended up demanding low more because they would quickly learn to accommodate the general larger group. So that is a case where like there's this kind of lovely bleeding, like this theoretical finding in biology, and then like we were replicating it using more economic style models to talk about a cultural case, and then like moved it into the lab and did experimental work and found that it did actually happen in the lab. Yeah, so there's been crosstalk, but yeah.
I was wondering if you had any, you know, data or just insights about sort of like in thinking about intersectionality and how, you know, if there are multiple gradients along which power is distributed, that it seems like when they're interacting, at least in the real world, it sort of ends up like there's some degree of hierarchical organization of those individual axes themselves. So how does that, how does that manifest in the model? Because it seems like you could just have sort of 4 arbitrary points, you know, if there are 2 axes or something like that, but it doesn't seem like that's how it actually manifests in the world,
Yeah. So along with Justin Bruner, who I mentioned, and Liam Bright, who's also a philosopher, we did this sort of one paper asking like, well, can we have different types that go along different intersections of this model? It turned out to be so complicated. As soon as you add the kind of multiple types, you have to start making a lot of choices. Like, do they all recognize these types as individually distinct categories to treat, right? Or is it that you take, say, race to be relevant and then gender to separately be relevant, but it's not like you're like, whatever, white women are one separate group and then black women are another separate group and the shared womanness does nothing. So you have to choose those things. What we ended up doing was trying a bunch of different variations, like one where it's like the intersections mean that you now have 4 distinct groups. It's basically just a 4-group model. Another one where we were like, the intersections mean that in some arenas you're conditioning on one type, and in another arena you're conditioning on the other type. So maybe at home you condition on gender, in the workplace you condition more on race or something. That would just be like a little example. And then maybe there can be kind of interactions between the two such that the payoff in one shapes the payoff in another, things like that. Certainly another thing that we thought about is something like, what if you have situations where it's not just that you always condition on one type in one arena and one type in another, where there's some salience, but you sort of probabilistically focus on those types, or there could be some gradation of strategy, some gradation of strategies where it's like, if I already learned this for women of that race, maybe it more likely for women of another race, but not 100%. There are all sorts of things that like popped up and were really difficult. Yeah, I don't know if that was responsive to this thing about power and like power mattering more in different areas and for different things. Okay. Yeah, but I take it to be, we were like, let's never model this again. It's too hard. And also nobody liked that paper. Every referee was either like, why would you ever use models for intersectionality? Or like, I'm an economist and your models are dumb. Like, okay. Yeah.
So I was wondering whether you had modeled or thought about cases where you can either, where types are more fluid and you can switch type at will, or cases where you can disguise type. Just thinking about bargaining, moving from in-person to the internet, or having certain kinds of types where, they're easily maskable.
Oh yeah, that's
Sort of how that changes the dynamics of
Yeah.
the emergence of inequality or people's positionality within that space.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I had never thought about like cases where you can disguise types, and I mean even going back to like women authors who would just only write and give a different name, like that's a kind of disguising. So I mostly focused on models where type was fixed, with the idea that like I'm most interested in focusing on cases where other cultural forces have already stabilized what categories matter, and then asking what happens next. But other people, and in some cases myself, have looked at models where there's some ability to change type. So if you just make anyone can change type, any way they want, these equilibria disappear. Because everyone would just switch to the type that's like getting more, and then you're going to end up with everyone getting the same payoff in the end. So the sort of inability to switch is necessary to create inequality. But you can have cases where it's like difficult to switch, or you can't always convince everyone that you've switched. And in those you could still get inequality kind of emerging, you know, mostly the same but not quite as clean, basically. Yeah, like if everyone could just be entirely fluid, then it always reverts to a one population model where there's no ability for different payoffs. If that makes sense.
Yeah, so like if you're, I guess, does it just delay the emergence of, or the sort of, you know, triumph of the have-mores? Or can it actually change the dynamics? I mean, it's, you know, if you're entering into like, I don't know, whatever, negotiations about a small business loan, and you can, you know, like, whatever, or asking out a partner or something, and you like, you can fake having more assets than you do. Does that, like, if you have that ability to sort of temporarily deceive, does it just sort of take, does it just extend
Just
the
take
timeline,
longer.
or can it actually cause people to sort of switch into a different group, and then once they're there, they can succeed?
Well, notice that in these models, there isn't any structure, like temporal structure within the bargain or an individual interaction. It's that like it just happens in a round, it's done, then you change your strategies. And so there isn't a way to represent a case where you could like fool people for a while and then
It's like a fake it till you make it, right?
yeah,
Where
you
it's-
can't represent that. You can only represent someone being taken as the other tag, right? That like someone treats you as if you have the other tag.
'Cause these are single shot.
Right, they're single shot interactions. It's not like a bargain where like I say X and you say Y and we go back and forth till we agree. Yeah, that would take a more like psychologically robust, focused on individual agents type model than the stuff here. It's really interesting though. I mean, I think there's like some relevance to cases where in fact people's ability to tell disappears. So that's not, like with gender it's pretty linked up with sex differences, so that's harder. But when it comes to things like class and caste, you often see situations where there are these like traditional ways that everyone can differentiate the groups. And then sometimes those break down so that individuals can start easily posing as members of another caste or class. And once that happens, it would totally shift the dynamics of what you see in these models. Yeah.
Another question about modeling powers, thinking through this, perseverating on the question, but is there a fundamental difference between the outside option idea and sort of like being able to walk away from the deal and what would happen versus bringing more or less to the table?
Uh-huh.
Are those,
Yeah.
because I mean, I'm thinking about lots of cases like feudalism where you have a landlord and then they allow a serf to live on and farm part of the property, but there's a
Yeah.
huge asymmetry
Yeah.
in what they're bringing to
What they're
it.
giving, yeah.
Or like a Hollywood producer and you're an unknown screenwriter,
Yeah.
right? And
Yes.
is
So
it the same, is it sort of just symmetrical to thinking about outside options?
No.
Or it's different?
You'd actually, so you'd want to treat it in a different way. And it's another situation where often the same people who had good outside options could also bring more to the table. But the way you model the latter thing is as when I bargain, the pie is bigger. So whenever you bargain with me, we make a bigger pie. So I have the ability to create more resource. And so for example, in this model I mentioned where we were looking at like homophily especially in science, we were like, well, okay, so what you mostly see in those models is homophily, like we assume one side discriminates against the other and then the other side's like, no thank you. But what if you have a scenario where one side can create more pie? Then sometimes you have cases where it's worthwhile to be discriminated against to get access to that pie, and of course you see that kind of thing happening in the real world all the time, like the landowner sharecropper situation.
Right.
Yeah.
Cool, thank you.
Yeah.
Any last questions? Okay, well, join me in thanking our speakers.
All right.